In 1963, segregation, the separation of whites and blacks, was common across the United States. Birmingham, Alabama, widely considered the most segregated city in the United States, was a more focused example of the division, hatred, and violence that were boiling over in many areas of the country. In particular, one event in Birmingham, the bombing of a church in which 4 young girls were killed on September 15, 1963, shaped the way the rest of the country viewed segregation and ultimately moved the civil rights movement forward. On January 10, 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. and 60 other African American ministers gathered to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The group was determined to change the country without using violence and encourage Anglo-Americans to stop watching as wrongs were committed against the black community. Encouraged by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a pastor and civil rights activist from Birmingham, Alabama, the SCLC moved its base to Birmingham and began leading protest marches. Shuttlesworth told King, "If you come to Birmingham, you will not only gain prestige but really shake the country. If you win Birmingham, as Birmingham goes, so goes the nation." With protests, sit-ins, and marches happening almost daily, the Birmingham city government received a state circuit court injunction to stop the protests. On April 12th, Eugene Bull Connor, Commissioner of Public Safety and Fire Department Safety, raised the bail fee for the Birmingham jail from $300 to $1,200 as a way to suppress civil rights protesters. Unfaltered by the fine or court injunction, Martin Luther King led 53 African Americans on a march through Birmingham to the jail, resulting in the arrest of all the protesters. On the same day as the march, 8 white clergymen published an article in the local newspaper called A Call to Unity, in response to the sudden display of demonstrations against the segregation laws. In the letter, they took issue with events directed and led in part by outsiders, urging activists to engage in local negotiations and use the courts if their rights were being denied, rather than protesting. The term outsider was a thinly veiled reference to King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Reading the letter after his arrest, King responded with a letter from Birmingham jail. In the margin of an old newspaper and some toilet paper, he started his speech.
I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly.
On May 2nd, as another wave of demonstrations started with the Children's Crusade, more than 1,000 students left school and met at the 16th Street Baptist Church, lining up for a march around the town of Birmingham while calling out for the desegregation of schools. More than 600 kids were arrested that day. On May 3rd, as another wave of students were being directed to the church, Bull Connor changed the police tactics for keeping the protesters under control. As the children marched across Kelly Ingram Park, Connor ordered the city's fire hoses to be turned on the students, the water pressure forcing them to the ground and pushing them across the asphalt streets. Adult witnesses pushed forward to help the students, but were held back as police dogs jumped to attack anyone who came too close. Connor's acts on May 3rd marked an increase in the violence in Birmingham. Protests and demonstrations were often met with fire hoses and police dogs, and bombing soon became a regular occurrence. By now, the national media had made Birmingham its focus. A picture was released in the New York Times of a young man being attacked by a police dog. President Kennedy was shocked, and on June 11th, he addressed the nation on TV and radio with his historic civil rights speech.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
It was Sunday, September 15, 1963, and Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Wesley were all up preparing for church. The girls were in the same 8th grade class except for Denise, who was only 11, but nonetheless, they were all great friends. Carol had gotten up early and was on her way quickly, stopping by her grandparents' house like she did every Sunday morning. She wore a white lace dress with pink bows in her hair. Addie Mae and her sister Janie were on their way too, playing games along the way and making them later than usual. Her grandmother described Addie Mae as the sweetest child in the state of Alabama. Denise and her mother were hurrying to get her ready after sleeping in later than usual. Cynthia had been at church a while though, helping her mother prepare for the Sunday morning service. At 10:22, the bomb exploded. The church shook, black soot rising in the air. Denise's mother was screaming, "My baby, my baby." The air was filled with screams and dirt as the walls fell and the stained glass windows shattered. Everyone ran outside trying to find their children. 23 people had been injured, and as everyone gathered outside the church with their families to take care of their wounds, 4 girls remained missing. Members of the congregation worked with the police to search through the rubble. Soon, the first body was carried from the church. Under a white cloth was Addie Mae. Next, they brought out Cynthia and Denise, and then finally Carol, all of whom were found lying next to each other in what was left of the downstairs bathroom. Riots broke out, buildings were set on fire, African Americans began attacking whites, and the whites fought back. Not only did the 4 girls die that day, but also 2 young boys who were only a few grades above the girls were shot by a police officer. The boys had attacked the officer, saying, "If it weren't for you, they'd still be well and smiling." At the funeral for the girls, more than 8,000 mourners were in attendance, both black and white. The girls' death cast a shroud over Birmingham and the rest of the United States as the media shared the sad story. King spoke at the funeral saying, "For the rest of the nation, the Birmingham church bombing should serve to goad the conscience. The deaths, in a sense, are on the hands of each of us." The letter from Birmingham jail, aggression against the Parker High School students, and the death of the 4 young girls in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963's Birmingham, Alabama, opened the eyes of the country to the violence and cruelty associated with the segregation of whites and blacks. African Americans horrified by the killings of the 4 young girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church saw voting rights as a critical step in their ability to protect their children. On January 23, 1964, the 24th Amendment was put into place, abolishing the poll taxes that originated after the Reconstruction era, making it seemingly impossible for poor blacks to vote. On July 2, 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Bill, outlawing discrimination in public accommodations and discrimination by employers. The bill strengthened federal powers to enforce desegregation in schools, restaurants, and workplaces. It took decades for the murders of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair to be resolved. Robert E. Chambliss, a member of the Ku Klux Klan, the first man to be identified as a perpetrator of the bombing, was only charged a small fine. A few months later, he was summoned to another trial and was proven guilty. He was sentenced to a life in prison and died there in 1985. The case was reopened several other times until 2 former Klansmen, Thomas Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry, were finally brought to trial. Blanton was convicted in 2001 and Cherry in 2002. In the year of 1963, Birmingham, Alabama brought the civil rights movement to the national forefront. The effect of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was immediate and significant. Outrage over the tragic deaths of the 4 innocent girls moved the nation's heart towards the safety and rights of African Americans, proving the bombings of the 16th Street Baptist Church to be a major turning point in the civil rights movement. In that important sense, the bombing's impact was exactly the opposite of what the perpetrators had intended.